Hello and welcome to Bright Blue Innovation. I'm your host, Lidia Paulinska. Today's episode is highlight from the technology direction of connected cars and wireless technology. Starting off the episode is a summary from Fireside Chat with Ajit Pai, Chairman of FCC, that was put on by the Lincoln Club in San Francisco. Following this discussion, we have a short one-on-one interview with 5G America's president, Chris Pearson, and then some highlights on the connected car discussion. The event was coordinated by US memory producer Micron Technology. We hope you enjoy this overview of the next step in our mobile world.
Nearly 25 million Americans have very limited access to high-speed broadband internet. And we all know that in order to be involved in the internet economy, to have access to opportunities, that is really sort of a baseline requirement.
So I do want to shift to kind of the main reason that we're all gathered here, which is to talk about broadband and getting broadband to more people. Obviously, I don't think there's no anti-broadband people that I know of. Everyone would like everyone to have broadband. How do you see that happening? What's the role of government? What's the role of the private sector? What can be done to accelerate getting more people with internet connections?
Speaking for myself, this is my personal passion. On my first full day in office as chair, I gave a speech to the FCC's employees in which I said this would be the #1 priority of our agency, closing the digital divide. And I don't just say that because it's a statutory command that the FCC in the Section 1 of the Communications Act is charged with making available to all Americans advanced communications services. I also say it because in 2017, for virtually anything in American life, internet access is critical. If you want to apply for a job, if you want to start a business, if you want telemedicine and other healthcare digitally, if you want to educate your kids, so much of this depends on access. And I've been in far too many parts where that access is either insufficient or doesn't exist at all. And I'm still haunted, as I've mentioned often, of my visit to about a month or so ago to Mission, South Dakota, where I visited the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. 83% unemployment, high poverty rates, of course. But I especially remember the story of a woman who was found dead in her home, clutching her cell phone. She was in distress, she was older and had health problems. She dialed 911 38 times, but she never got through to emergency personnel because there simply wasn't wireless coverage. And so to me, that was just the starkest example of the fact that there is a digital divide in this country between those who have access to advanced technologies and those who don't. And to me at least, and I'm sure to many of you, access to broadband is not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue, it's an American issue. And if we want to capture all of the human capital that is currently sitting on the shelf in the analog, so to speak, parts of this country, if we want to empower every American with digital opportunity, which I do, then I think the FCC is squarely positioned and is responsible for making sure that we push technologies as far into the countryside as we can.
So my guess is you'd get zero. There are not that many things that you get no disagreement on in politics, but I think everyone would agree with broadband as a goal. How do we get
Depending
there?
on, well, yeah, I hope that's true. How do we get there is very difficult. The FCC has a couple of tools in the toolbox, one of which is the federal subsidy program that we oversee. We have several $1 billion that we send into the private sector each year to spur the build out of these networks. And in my first full month as chairman, when we had the chance to set the agenda, we got across the finish line on a bipartisan basis, I might add, which is somewhat rare in Washington, as you might have heard. We got across the finish line a $4.5 billion plan to push 4G LTE into all parts of the country that are currently unserved with a wireless service, and a $2 billion plan to push fixed broadband, the wireline broadband services that we all know, into unserved parts of the country. There are a number of different elements of that, which I'd be happy to get into, but in the gist of it is that we're trying to use these scarce federal dollars to benefit the people who are currently on the wrong side of the divide. The second piece, the second tool in the toolbox, so to speak, is modernizing our regulations, recognizing, for instance, that it doesn't make sense anymore for us not to give access to all kinds of broadband providers, big and small, who want access to the poles and the ducts and the conduits that are in the ground in order to lay fiber. I still remember a trip I made to Detroit earlier this year, where Rocket Fiber, a new competitive upstart, wants to string fiber in parts of Detroit that have long since been written off, but they said the critical element for them is getting timely and cheap access to utility poles. Well, that's something that we're aiming to do, to modernize our rules and to recognize that some of these competitors need access in real time. The other piece of that, well, there are many other pieces of it that I could go into.
And we can get into a bunch of them. I am curious, kind of that first layer down that you mentioned is historically broadband, when we talk broadband, we meant fixed internet service.
Right.
Is wireless enough in this day and age with the speeds you get with LTE? Should we be having a wireless versus wireline debate, or can wireless really deliver all the broadband anyone needs, and should we be focused there?
That's one of the questions that the FCC is thinking about right now is to what extent we should think about wireless as a complement or substitute for wired. As the most recent wireless competition report that the FCC is considering points out, LTE now is achieving 23.6 megabits per second speed, and so that's one of the things we need to think about. Also, it depends on the application. I mean, if I'm updating my fantasy football lineup, obviously then in most cases wireless would be sufficient. If you're doing some heavy-duty downloading of 4K video, then it might be a different question. So it's also tailored to the nature of the application, I would say.
So do you think it's too soon to tell, or we're just not quite there yet?
I think it's, well, right now it's too soon for the FCC to tell. It's one of the things we're thinking about in our so-called 706 Notice of Inquiry. I love how we make these things super accessible.
You guys make it so fun.
Oh, it's great. We're trying to cut down on the number of acronyms that we use and the amount of jargon, but it's a difficult road to hoe.
You mentioned the recent report on competition, and I'm curious. So for those who don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I read fairly briefly, I was at a little Apple event this morning, but
Did they announce something? I wasn't...
Something. I think they're building a park in Cupertino. The FCC report for the first time said there's healthy, robust competition in wireless. And I'm curious what that means, and does that mean it's great, we can all celebrate? I think a couple of the companies that make up that robust competition have expressed some interest in potentially consolidating. I'm curious if two of them merge, would we still have robust competition? How do you think about competition among the wireless carriers?
That's a great question, and for those of you who haven't had a chance to see, you can find it on our website, fcc.gov. We now, this is another one of my great innovations at the FCC, we actually publish proposals and orders and reports before we vote on them, which was not the norm for many years previous. I know that sounds ridiculous to many of you, but that's the way we did business. Anyway, in this report, one of the things we find is that some of the indicia of competition are very strong. So for instance, the number of mobile subscriptions is up. We now have 400 million mobile subscriptions in the United States, 121% mobile penetration rate, which is more mobile subscriptions than we have people. The price per megabit per second is down. It was $1.37 in 2007. It's less than half a cent now in 2017. Prices are going down as well, and speeds are going up. So we take a look at some of those things we find on net. Consumers are better off and the competition is thriving. However, as I made clear in a speech this morning, I personally believe that there are significant challenges. And I use the example of the woman in Mission, South Dakota. There are many parts of this country that don't have 4G LTE, where wireless service is not a given. And I personally have experienced those. I've logged something like 3,000 road miles driving across the United States from, recently I drove all the way from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Casper, Wyoming. And in many parts of the country, the signal would be very weak or just drop altogether. So I recognize that there are challenges that remain, and we're committed to solving those challenges. But I think looking at it on a macro level, we try to take a fair look at the facts, and we do find that the marketplace is competitive.
I mean, on the competition piece, it wasn't that long ago you had two really strong competitors and two really weak competitors. T-Mobile got really aggressive several years ago now. They've accounted for most of the growth in the industry in terms of smartphone subscriptions. Sprint has grown some in recent, but kind of struggling. They're still much smaller, even though much healthier than they were, especially T-Mobile. They're still much smaller. Would one combined be stronger? Would there still be healthy competition? Or the previous administration seemed to think 4 was the magic number?
I know that there's a lot of commentary about this. Some economists and financial folks will make the case that they'd be stronger together. Others make the case that they'd be stronger apart. As a regulator, however, I can't prejudge any particular issue. It's highly fact-dependent. It depends on what facts are in the record, and we want to be able to test different arguments against each other. And so unless and until a particular transaction is presented to us, I have to give the unsatisfactory answer I know that I can't opine about the merits or demerits of a particular.
On the subject of sort of broadband and how we get it to more, I do want to drill down a little more in, you've got a room of people, Microsoft, Google are going to speak later. What would you like to see those companies do? What is their role? What is the role of everyone here in doing it? And what should they rightly ask you, the government, to be doing?
I personally want every single company which is in this space to compete as vigorously as possible. As a regulator, I am technology neutral. I could care less what technology is brought to bear on the equation when it comes to solving the digital divide. And that's part of the reason why in June, the FCC unanimously approved the application of an innovative satellite company, OneWeb, which wants to deploy approximately 720 satellites into low Earth orbit. That's part of the reason why in South Boston, Virginia, I had a chance to meet with the team at Microsoft to talk about their white spaces proposals and meet a young man, Dylan Harris, who used that broadband application to do his homework that he couldn't do previously. That's part of the reason why we're teeing up a lot of spectrum for fixed wireless companies. And some of these are very small mom and pop companies that nobody will know, but they're critical to solving the equation in rural and low income areas. We want all of these companies to have a full and fair opportunity to compete. And so from my perspective, we want to make sure that we have a regulatory framework that enables them to compete on a level playing field. And I'm really excited about where we are. I recognize that there are significant challenges in the broadband marketplace, but based on the innovation I've seen in these various sectors, we stand on the brink of something big. And if we can bring them all to bear to solve the digital divide, that's something that benefits every single American.
Let's trade.
Oh,
If I get cut off, it's less of a big deal.
that's certainly not true.
We'll cut off his mic in a sec. We know a lot gets written about some of the legislation and policies that you aren't in favor of the FCC handling. One comes to mind, I think there were a few protesters in favor of net neutrality.
Oh, I thought it was AM radio. I wasn't sure which one. Okay.
But I'm
It's always
curious,
an evergreen. Yes.
I'm curious to get your thoughts a different way. What do you see as good regulation? What should the FCC be regulating? What does ideal regulation look like to you?
I think ideal regulation is regulation that solves a market failure. Regulation that creates a competitive marketplace that otherwise would not exist but for those rules. And that's part of the reason why I consistently say, whenever I'm thinking about a regulation, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And do the costs of this regulation outweigh the benefits? I know it sounds incredibly elementary, but it really is as fundamental as that. I remember back when I was taking my administrative law class with Cass Sunstein, who was the head of the regulatory affairs shop in the Obama White House. And one of the things he would consistently make us think about is, look, this rule sounds good in the abstract. What are the impacts of the rule? Is the rule solving a market failure? And if not, could there be unintended consequences that would actually disincentivize investment or distort place in ways that would disserve consumers? How can you measure the costs and the benefits? And so those are some of the things that I think about. And so that's why I don't really like the term deregulation or hyper-regulation. It's simply, in my view at least, the goal is to make sure that our rules are tailored to the marketplace that exists in 2017. Not the marketplace that might have existed in 1975 or 1982 or even 1996. This is a very dynamic marketplace, and we want to make sure that our rules don't stand in the way of innovation and investment and actually hold back companies that are looking to build new business models and to benefit their customers.
Lidia Paulinska, Roadway Media. I have a question on behalf of the audience of our shows. And the audience is the content creators and distributors. So how do you think the changes in net neutrality are going to affect the content creators?
It's a good question, but it's premature. There are no changes to the net neutrality regulations. That's what we're currently considering, is whether there should be any changes and what those changes should be. So I'm afraid I can't tell you right now what our decision is going to be. We simply haven't reached a decision. But as I said before previously, however, all of us favor a free and open internet. We want an open environment in which content creators, among others, can develop some of the great content that American consumers enjoy and be able to distribute it on a platform that reaches as many Americans as possible.
To ask that another way, you mentioned, one of the goals being broadband being more accessible to underrepresented groups.
Right.
Another issue is content for those groups and seeing people like them. And, if you're talking about underrepresented minorities or LGBT people, their media tends to be from smaller organizations. How concerned or not are you going into this process that as media consolidates among these telecom giants, there will be less of that niche content, less of that content targeting those underrepresented groups who may be finally getting internet but now won't see people like themselves?
To me, at least, one of the great things about the internet is that you now do have content that can reach audiences that previously weren't considered mass market, and so they didn't really have a voice. either on the content side or on their own, in terms of their own expression. And so that's one of the things going forward we want to preserve is, as I said, a free and open internet that allows anybody to have a voice on the internet and also to hear that voice in a way that isn't blocked or otherwise highly regulated.
Yeah, so 3 seconds, one time you changed your mind based on meeting people.
Oh gosh, so there have been several. One, I suppose, it doesn't necessarily relate to broadband, but I got a call about an issue that happened in South Carolina in which a prison guard had been shot 6 times in his home after a hit was put out on him by a number of inmates using a contraband cell phone. And I was alerted, look, this is a serious issue, you need to take a look at it. And previously I had thought, okay, look, there's really nothing the FCC could do here. That was the common understanding around this issue. But when I studied the issue and I actually went down to South Carolina, I visited the facility, the Lee Correctional Facility in Bishopville, South Carolina. I've now visited a number of other correctional facilities, voluntarily, I might add. And had a chance to understand the depth of the issue. I said, look, there is a role here for the FCC to play, and that's why we've teed up a number of solutions that could help correctional officials and just the general public stay safer. This is a problem a public safety threat that most people don't even think about, the fact that a smartphone, for instance, in the hands of a violent inmate can be used to put out a hit on a witness, to threaten innocent consumers with scams, to otherwise just really target members of the public. And so that's an issue where we have taken action, actually, as a matter of fact, and I'm really proud that we have.
All right, well, if everyone will join me in thanking the chairman for a great conversation.
Thanks very much. Thank you. That's great. A pleasure. A pleasure of mine.
Okay, so last year we were at this show. We were talking about 5G being like a coordinator in the space of mobile, and so tell us, update us, what is the status and time for 5G to roll out?
So you're looking at initial rollouts in probably late 2019 and then 2020. It's going to be take time to do those rollouts, and the standards are making great progress. The standards are being done at 3GPP, Third Generation Partnership Project, and they're doing a lot of really great work to get it done, and so that people can start to planning the silicone, the infrastructure, and the devices. So, 2019, 2020, when you're looking at rollouts. Now, the momentum will build much later on, but the initial rollouts could be in those timeframes.
So also looks like many of the futures for 5G is kind of towards the businesses, more or less consumer. So can you tell us about businesses the community of businesses are behind or maybe ahead? What is the progress in that?
Well, who's behind it really is the mobile wireless ecosystem. So that's operators and vendors that are already in the marketplace right now, but also new players that have an interest in 5G because it really is looking at wireless without any limitations that we've seen so much before. If you look at the ecosystem and what they would be addressing as far as use cases, there's 3 families of use cases. Enhanced mobile broadband is one use case family. A second use case family is the massive communications to communications. So that would be like, instead of talking about millions of devices being connected, we're talking billions of devices to be connected. And finally, the third use case family is the ultra reliability and communications and low latency communications. So those are the 3 families of use cases that this ecosystem is looking to address in 5G.
So for our target audience, who are the content creators, what that means 5G for them, how fast they can push the videos, how fast they can watch them on their devices.
Yeah, for content, I mean, what we've seen that the device has become, the third screen, or others would say a third screen and a fourth screen, and how many devices you have in your household or while you're moving in your car or wherever you might be. So for content folks, it's the opportunity to think about what can happen when you have faster speeds and lower latencies, which means things are being pushed out faster, they're loading faster. The experience for a user with their device or tablet or computer or even smart TV where people are using it is going to be faster and so forth. So there's just a lot of opportunities, I think, for the content distributors, the content creators, as well as just the overall ecosystem.
Exactly. So the 5G is going to affect IoT, is going to affect the driverless cars and smart cities, all these ecosystems, right? So is going to 5G solve everything?
Well, I don't think, it doesn't solve everything. And actually, I would be someone that would say, right now we're seeing progress in LTE and LTE Advanced and LTE Advanced Pro, which is the evolution of LTE to address many of these markets. And what 5G does is just brings in more capabilities, more capacity, more speeds, lower latency. But yeah, does 5G solve everything? No. But I can tell you as an organization that looks at or works on things in North America, Central America, and South America, many governments around the world are looking at LTE and 5G as ways to help solve some of the societal needs where it comes to things like transportation and education and a more efficient government, things like that. So there is a lot that the mobile wireless industry and the capabilities with LTE and 5G can do and will do.
So since we're seeing the North America being a leader in 5G, so how is it going to pull the other rest of the world with that?
Well, I do think, if you look at the United States has been, or North America has been a leader in LTE, and they'll continue to be a leader in 5G. And an example would be our FCC was the first government policy area to put out high millimeter spectrum to be utilized for 5G. That hasn't happened anywhere else in the world. So that kind of shows our leadership role. And we have a lot of innovative companies that are doing, some great inventing and standards contributions for 5G. How that compares to the rest of the world? Well, there's a lot of people that would like to be a leader when it comes to wireless. And so you're seeing that. I think you'll see the Asia Pacific region, for instance, the smaller geographic countries in the Asia Pacific region looking at how they can be a leader in 5G. But again, I think the U.S. is well positioned with spectrum coming out to market. We have innovative companies, but I think there is a lot of competition out there in the world that wants to be a leader in the mobile wireless space.
Thank you very much.
It used to be, if you look through the past decades, we would pick one thing that was driving data. It was email at one point. It was photos at one point. It was the creation of content from mobile devices. But now you look, and literally in every part of the technology industry, there's a staggering amount of data both needed and created. If you think about the enterprise, both storage and memory are going up at 5x over the next couple of years. And the reason is there's very, very large databases. We've got connectivity that allows those databases to be moved around, and we've got to find a way to get useful information from them. So this picture, I've used this for about 20-some years, but this is the first time I got to put a car on it. And it was a lot of thinking that sort of got to that and convinced me this is the right thing to do. The way I usually talk about this is every node in computing builds on the last. So you think about mainframes, workstations, PCs, smartphones, they all build on the last. There's a huge amount of learning, and they're all a couple of orders of magnitude larger than the last one in terms of opportunity. So I think if I was to start in my career now, while semiconductors was really interesting as a place to start and grow through the last 35 years, it really feels like the automotive industry is what semiconductors was 35 years ago.
Quite a few of us here came from the PC industry of old. And I was just doing some research online, and it feels like the autonomous vehicle industry is kind of like the PC industry was in about 1995. If you think about the budget for electronics in an autonomous car, at that time the PC sector was about 100 million units. Cars is about 90 million units now. So it feels like the industry is somewhat similar, and it was also very constrained on the number of transistors you could put in there and the energy you could put into it. So it feels like you've got a 30-year run ahead of you in autonomous as we get more and more sophisticated in the way we do the applications. As you look forward, what are the challenges that you see to this kind of sustained increase in sophistication of autonomous driving? Any thoughts on that?
I think you run into an immediate problem that you're dealing with an industry that has a lot of legacy. And some of the more enlightened automotive makers that I talk to think of them as data centers on wheels. They're not even thinking about it as a single computer anymore. They're thinking about it as a networked device that's moving around. And so there's a maturity aspect in the automotive industry for them to make that transformation and to kind of mentally shift from being manufacturers and makers of a mechanical device to being software companies and companies making technology and putting that technology into a computer.
The pace of technology is clearly accelerating. Has to, in order to do what we're asking these cars to go do, right? You can go back and you look, the first navigation systems were based on a DDR2 technology that was proven 5 to 7 years beforehand in PCs before it was adopted in the car. Today we're shipping LPDDR4 technology, latest and greatest process, 9 months after Mike's shipped it into a mobile application, right? So that speed of adapting technology is one of the responses to what you're saying. We're at the beginning of that transformation of the automobile, or the next transformation of the automobile, let's say, right?
So when you think about we talked a little bit about some of the sources of data. There's the telemetry stuff, there's the sensors in an autonomous vehicle. What are the sources of data that maybe people aren't thinking about? And not necessarily in the short term, but in the medium term. What are the sources of data that will have to be handled by the autonomous car of the future, or the connected car of the future?
Smartphones, right? And you think about how that industry has changed, and think about so many industries that have built up around the smartphone, right? The exact same thing will happen when we get to autonomous cars. There will be services. You will have Netflix for the car, right? You will have apps, as you said. I mean, there's all that is another source of data that has to be stored, processed, pulled down from the cloud, run over somebody's network, et cetera, right? So I think what you'll see as you get to critical mass on autonomous vehicles is that set of services that are going to develop and businesses that are going to develop around them.
So what I was going to say is that, yes, you have a plethora of sensors in the car, LiDARs, radars, ultrasonic, cameras. It's impossible to upload that all to the cloud. You're talking, gigabytes of
I would
data.
love it if you did.
Yeah, exactly. But what you're going to do instead is it's metadata, it's the occupancy grid, it's tracking objects. But where it gets interesting is if you are connected and you have a high bandwidth connection, your sensors, the other cars on the road are now your additional sensors. So as a car hits black ice, and it understands that it's on black ice, it lets all the cars know around it. They start moving out of the way. But basically, that's the metadata that you're sending up, and then it comes down to processed in real time, rather than actually sending, raw sensor data.